Hello, my name is Dick DeAngelis. I'm the director of the Fairfield History Series, and welcome to another episode of Inside Fairfield's History. Today, we're going to show you an interview we did in our studios with Anton Till, retired Fairfield archaeologist. And you know, one of the things about Anton, as a field archaeologist, he has the most experience in digs regarding Jefferson County. So when I went up to the University of Iowa archaeologist's office, they said, "Oh, you're dealing with Anton. He really knows what he's talking about in terms of Jefferson County archaeology." So I thought you'd like to see a little more about the structures and the things that give us the hints about our past here in Jefferson County. Here's Anton Till.
I was attending a teacher's college in Monmouth College in West Long Branch, New Jersey. And the college was associated with this huge mansion. It was a palace. That's where we had classes. It was very expensive. And I met, it was the first year I was there, and I met a student who, I don't know why I met him, but he just, well, I came from Parsons. Yeah, it's out in Fairfield, Iowa. What? Fairfield, Iowa? Where's that at, you know? Is that where grow potatoes? No. So I got interested in it. And they had this interesting brochure. And they were, the way they photographed the campus looked like there was a huge lake surrounding the campus. That was this incredible place. And I got interested in it, and I contacted them, and it was affordable. And we have a work study program. What's that? Well, you can work and pay for your tuition. Well, that's novel. So I signed up, and I remember the day I got on a plane in Philly, and I went to Chicago, and from Chicago I was going to get a train, but I had to stay overnight in a YMCA. And I remember one guy says, "Well, if you stay here, you always block the door with a chair." I said, "Okay, I'll do that." But anyhow, I got up and got on the train station.
Sorry, you need to restart with the train station because
I did something, yeah. But anyhow, I got up in the morning and I went to the train station. I got on the train, and I remember the train it was a long trip to Fairfield, Iowa. And it was very hot. It was like, I don't know, this train had like steam coming up. But anyhow, when I got to Fairfield, there was a group of people from Fairfield, and they were standing there with a sign. "Anyone from Parsons College, come here," you know, there's that airport thing. So anyhow, I went and I said, "Yeah, I am." And of course, I was crew cut, and you know, I had all my goods and stuff. And I remember I had a $100 bill, and it was stuck in an envelope in my shirt. That's the only money I had. It was a $100 bill. But anyhow, I got to Parsons, and it was amazing. It was just, it was a bustling place. We went to, I remember going to the main building up there. It had a big fireplace in it, and stuff. It was just, you know, the bookstore in it and all that stuff. And they had all these people there housing, and you would try to find housing. And they had, well, this is from the high rises. And then there was all these fraternities groups. And I was walking along like this, I'm just like this, fruitcake from New Jersey. And there was a group, the Sigma Pi fraternity group. They saw me, and for some reason, man, we got to have this guy. And I said, well, I don't want to join no fraternity. And no, you can stay at our place. We got plenty of room, and it was the quads, one of the quads, original quads. And I got up there and got into them, eventually joined this fraternity and everything, and we had some wild times. But Parsons College, I was impressed with it because I could work after school, I could pay my bills, and it wasn't all what everybody said it was. Yes, we had parties, our fraternity. I was actually social chairman for a stint, and we did have some incredible parties. We had party houses we actually had rented. It was a fun time. There was a lot of activities, and that back in 1969, 1970 was really, really great time. And then things changed. In Parsons, they had money problems and this problem. But as far as the education and the people, they had some incredible educators there, very good educators. And they were there because they wanted to teach. They weren't there to write. See, what's the difference? You don't go sit in a class and you have an assistant do the class while the professor's out doing his research. And you had some notable people there. So my experience at Parsons changed a lot because during those times I got to know Iowa and really like it. So I stayed. Met an Iowa girl during my later years. I graduated in 1972, and I remember that well. And but I stayed, and I stayed. I did get involved in archaeology, but I had to work in a factory. I mean, I had to do a lot of things. I worked in a hospital as an orderly during, because I worked in class and I worked at nights. And I remember in order, I had like a $1,200 bill I had to pay to graduate. So I went to the First National Bank and walked in and I said, I got to borrow money to graduate. And the guy looked at you, well, are you going to stay here? I said, yeah, I married somebody from here. Are you going to stay here? Yeah, okay. Gave me $1,200 and I paid off my college and I got my diploma. So there was that in that stuff. And I've stayed here ever since. And I've worked in Iowa and in archaeology and other things. And I worked for the Planning Commission. And so I've done many things. But archaeology is always my favorite. It was always my mainstay, I think, to keep my sanity. And today I'm retired from the University of Iowa, but I miss those days. I can't physically do the things that younger people do because I have all kinds of issues, as you get, bone issues and muscle issues. But I miss it. And there's things I'd like to get back to doing in archaeology, doing some research and that sort of thing. I was involved in several studies. One was done in early 1980s, and it was called a coal land survey. And at that time, I worked for the Office of Historic Preservation. And essentially, my job was to go out, just walk around in the fields, looking for evidence of archaeological sites in areas of potential development of coal mines, because at that time there was a lot of talk and interest of developing a new coal industry in Iowa, not only in Jefferson County but also in other counties. Monroe County, for example, is one of them. And so the State Historic Preservation Office is interested in would be the impacts to archaeological sites if large strip mines were being excavated all over Iowa. And there were plans for huge strip mine areas, especially around Albia, north of Albia. And I actually worked on another project to actually survey those areas. But getting back to Fairfield, my first experience in really recording archaeological sites right in the immediate vicinity of Fairfield was during the coal land survey, the initial one. And I worked in areas like along the Cedar Creek area, south of town, all the way up to the southwest part of town. I walked up and explored some of the landscapes along Crow Creek, which runs along the eastern edge of Fairfield. And what I did find was a number of sites that were related to what we call the woodland culture. In Iowa, what we call, the archaeologists call woodland culture, are prehistoric people who use pottery. They were hunting and gathering folks, but they also built burial mounds. Their main mortuary sites were, they would excavate pits on high areas, on bluffs, for example, and interned their dead. Sometimes there were secondary burials. They were buried initially above ground somewhere, in trees or on racks, and then the tribal members would come back, gather the bones, and to have a ceremony and bury them in the ground. And then they would build mounds. And some of these mounds are small, but in Iowa we have mounds that are quite large, like 10 feet high and extend over 30, 40 feet. So they're quite noticeable in the landscape. But anyhow, that's one of the traits of the woodland people. The woodland people were also the pottery. The use of pottery was really very important to them. They were doing more hunting and gathering, but they were started to grow crops like beans and squash and that sort of thing. And because of that, probably the horticulture they were involved in, they were producing crops that would have to store foods over the wintertime. And so pottery was developed. So those are the main things. But getting back to the actual sites, most of the sites in this vicinity are located on ridges or down on terraces along the stream valleys. Apparently a lot of the people were moving up, the woodland people were moving up the Skunk River area, then up Big Cedar Creek, and then as Big Cedar Creek to the various tributaries, they would move up and have various camps in those areas. But that's what I discovered during the coal areas, that most of the sites that I found had pottery on them, and they also had projectile points that had been previously identified and classified as being woodland. There were early woodland people, there was middle woodland people, and late woodland people. Archaeologists divide those in those three different divisions. Essentially, the early woodland were people who had pottery, but it was kind of a crude form. Some was really thick and crudely made. Then as the woodland approached the middle woodland period, and then it became more sophisticated, including their building mounds and earthworks, in fact, even. In late woodland, the people became, again, still hunting and gathering. They did have seasonal camps and were involved in horticulture. But their pottery became more portable. It seemed like lighter. The walls were very thin and highly decorated rims. It was more refined, but it also looked like it was more portable. It was used, they were moving around a lot. I don't know, but the Woodland period was fascinating, and all the evidence, pretty much all the evidence I found in this particular area was related to woodland camps or semi-permanent type little campsites and villages. The Woodland period comes in like 500 BC and extends up to about 1000 AD. And around 1000 AD, the late woodland people, or the late woodland period, goes into more the later cultures, essentially more bigger village type people. They started to seem to form more larger villages. They're essentially proto-historic. When the Europeans first came here in North America, people were living in large villages at that time. And late woodland villages, like in Illinois and in parts of Iowa, were those large villages that may have contained 2,000 or 3,000 people. Sometimes they were fortified. In fact, in many instances, these villages were fortified. So there seemed to be a huge increase in population during that late woodland period. And there was probably a lot of conflicts between different groups back then. But in our particular area around Fairfield, I did locate a number of real interesting woodland sites. There's a small creek that comes off Cedar Creek, just located maybe 2 miles from Fairfield. And there's what we call an interfluve. It's a large linear type landform that's elevated that extends between two drainages. One, Cedar Creek, is to the east of it, and a smaller stream borders it. And it's quite elevated, and it's probably a half mile or so long. I would go to the Soil Conservation Service and get aerial photographs of the area that I'm going to actually survey. And they would have a photograph of a section, an aerial photograph, and they have all the soils marked on there. But I would use them to actually use it in the field. If I found something, I would also mark it down on the map, the aerial map. Because at that time, the USGS, they did not have topographic coverage for this area. There was no topographic maps available. And that was back in the 1970s. And so topographic maps, when they came in, became really important because you could find something on the surface and you could be identified on the map more accurately. Aerial maps, then, I carried in the field with me. And in this particular area, when I was looking on one of these aerials, I noticed there was kind of colorations along this ridge. And I asked the Soil Conservation Service, I said, do you have any earlier aerials? And holy smokes, they had really old ones taken during the Second World War. And when I looked on those, clearly in the same area I was walking, actually field surveying, there was a whole series of concentric rings all the way along this ridge. And essentially what I was looking at that time when that aerial was taken, it was in hay ground, and it had been cultivated, not cultivated, but harvested. And these rings were actually mounds, and they would show up on that aerial as small circles. And when I went on the landscape and actually walked that particular ridge, I found all these burial mounds. There are a whole group of them along this mound. And it's one of the bigger mound groups in this particular area. Once you find a mound group like that, then you know that somewhere very close by is the habitation area. And right below where the mound is located, there is a terrace, and on this terrace was this large woodland village site. and it stretches over maybe 4 or 5 acres. It's very large. And this is within 2 miles of the river. So those are the probably more significant sites as far as how much landscape is actually was used by them. But there are a number, literally hundreds of different smaller sites all along the Cedar Creek. We have small sites that are up, that extend up the little Crow Creek that runs along the eastern part of Fairfield. And most of those sites are, we call them extraction sites. They're sites where people would move up these small creeks and they would discover a certain type of tree, for example, like wild plums. When the early settlers came in, one thing they noticed, and they were quite happy about it, was in Jefferson County were these large groves of wild plum. And they were located up these little drainages and up these what we call head slopes. It's where a little drainage comes up and it ends, but then it goes up on a higher elevation. There's kind of a ditch there. But around those little valleys and real small ditches were these large groves of wild plum. And they loved them because a family could live off these things. And there's evidence that when we go up these valleys and up the same type of landscapes, we find evidence that people lived there. They actually camped there, had fires, there's a few artifacts, that sort of thing. And we call them extraction sites. They're coming up, camping, and probably processing wild plums or walnuts or some other type of food product that's produced on trees. That's it seems like what's going on Crow Creek. It's a process. It's a resource extraction area, and maybe the same people who are living just outside the southwest of town were going up those areas, gathering foods and bringing it down back to the village. All the people back then, going back thousands of years, were involved in more of what we call a seasonal round. Very, very important to understand this because that's in understanding how native peoples use the environment. The seasonal round is really a way a people can extract resources when the climate, the weather allows them to do so. In the wintertime, the winters back then were really serious affairs. And many of the settlers who came in learned that real quick, that, you know, if you were in a cabin, if you were lucky to have a cabin, and we're not living in a tent or something like that, and the winter started and the snows fell, you did not move very far. You were really restricted. It was bad enough for the native vegetation that was like a wall wherever you walked. Native blue stem that, you know, was 10 feet tall. You'd had all kinds of vines, wild pea vines that were so thick a horse couldn't go through. And so imagine that environment with 3 feet of snow on it or 4 feet of snow. It would be very difficult to go out and find resources to survive the winter. So the seasonal round was what essentially when it was warm, starting early in the spring, you would start looking for resources and gather resources all the way into the fall. And it was most of all your time was spending is not only just finding food to eat, you know, at that moment, but finding abundance of it where you could save it, bank it, create larders, so you can survive the winter months. And that's what the people were involved in that round. They were the way they lived, the way they moved, all was dependent on the resource extraction. So in the summer months, you were fishing. You were trying to find as much fish as you can. The Muskootans, for example, in Muscatine Island, they're they were involved in harvesting large quantities of freshwater buffalo. Buffalo is a large carp-like fish. Many of them weigh up to 50, 60 pounds. But the buffalo, they harvested them and they would take the strips of meat off them and dry them over racks. And they would have huge areas along the floodplain with racks with meat drying. And that meat was then dried, and then they would put in pottery or bags or baskets and things of that nature, and stored for the winter months. It was true of food, any kind of thing that could grow. In the later part in the woodland times, people were growing squash, for example. And squash, you would harvest it and do the same process. You'd strip it into long strips and tie it in knots, and then hang it over like a rope over a rack, a drying rack, and it was dried and then stored. In later times, for like the woodland times, late woodland times, and protohistoric times, when people started living in more larger villages, people were digging large pits in the ground. It's like the Crosby icebox, but an earlier version. And you essentially dig a large hole. Some were bell-shaped. They would dig them out in an area that was well drained. They didn't want to dig in a marshy area; it would fill with water. You'd have to drill a very specific place to dig them, and then you would prepare the insides of these large cache pits. Some were lined with clay and packed in there, so they were almost like a big pottery vessel. And then they would line them with grasses, nice dry grasses, and fill it with grass. And then these dried foods could be stored in there, packed in and stored. And many times, when they came up to the surface, where the pit opening was kind of narrow, they would seal that off with clay. A large slab of clay was pounded over and sealed that pit. And that would stay that way for the whole winter. And a lot of these pits were located actually within their houses. They built lodge, and inside the floor, along the floor, would be holes in these cache pits. So that allowed them to actually live in there, walk over the cache pit. When you got hungry, you dug one up and start using that larder. So the seasonal round was really important to them, and that's how Native people survived. They were probably 90% of their time was spent in procuring food and storing it and processing it, so when that winter came, they could stay in one particular area. Another important aspect of that, the way of life, using a seasonal round, is in the summer months, all the families would get together. You know, it's just not an extended family. It's people, their relations, tribal group, if you want to, many families. They could come together and occupy a fairly large site and use their labor, because it would take a lot of labor to process all this food. And so now there was a lot of people, a lot of hands to do a lot of this stuff. And as winter approached, the group then, probably individual families, would go up these stream valleys way up. It could be 20 miles, and locate an area that would have enough resources and cover that they could build a winter wickiup, some sort of shelter up there to survive the winter. They would probably actually prepare the site, gather firewood, have food there, everything ready for them, so they can go up there and occupy it. And the why they did that was, if you were caught in the winter in a large village, for example, and you were snowed in, there's a very possibility that you wouldn't survive it. unless you had enough food available and stored on site. So earlier, before people lived in large villages, there were more hunting and gathering, so they had to split up in the wintertime. Later on, people in the large villages had actually storage. They had so much storage and food because they were doing a lot of gardening in the summertime, and they could stay in that village during the winter. The larger woodland sites that identified during the coal land survey in close proximity to Fairfield date approximately around 500 to 700 AD. And the reason we suspect that is based on the type of pottery that we find. Because that's what's unique about the woodland. When people have pottery, you have a way to identify it, and there's so many sites that have carbon dates. So we find a certain type of pottery that's in a pit, and we carbon date it, and we can get that's not absolute, but a relative date for that type of pottery, the type of decorations on it. So pottery is kind of a time marker, because in time, certain groups, and probably the women were the potters, they would make a certain type of decorations on that pottery. And it would be consistent for a considerable amount of time. So when I say, well, it's middle woodland pottery, well, what I'm saying is it has certain types of designs on it. There's pottery we classify as Hopewell ware. It's during the Hopewell period, in the middle woodland period, and it's very distinctive pottery. Late middle woodland pottery, for example, is very distinctive. It has, for example, it's cord roughened, it's grit tempered. The pottery clay is mixed with crushed rock. And there's a lot of crushed rock in that clay, a very large percentage of it. And it's fired, but prior to firing it, when it's in soft state, they would take a stick or a paddle, and this paddle would have a cord wrapped around it. And when you paddle the pottery, and it's part of the construction of the pottery, because you're coiling it, and when you coil it, to flatten out the coils, you hold probably a rock inside, flat pebble, and then you use the paddle to paddle the exterior, and you move around and move around, and that thins the pottery and it smooths out the coils so you don't see them anymore. Well, as you get up to the rim form, and you get up to the rim area, that's generally where people use unique type of decorations. They would take a small stick and wrap a cord around it, and take their finger and press linear depressions, cord impressions all around the lip. Sometimes they would take a stick and push it in from the rim out, and it make a little node, a little bump. And that type of pottery we find is in this particular area during the late middle woodland period. And that period would be around 700 AD. Another information that we got about that woodland area was that we actually excavated a mortuary site just about 2 miles from here. And essentially what it was the farmer was building terraces. And on this side of the upland, the terrace excavation disturbed a mound. And there was evidence of large rocks being plowed out, disturbed by the machinery. So we went there and did a kind of an excavation to define what it was, and to save it whatever was before it was destroyed. And what it was a box tomb. It was a grave that was made out of large sandstone slabs set vertically, and one on the bottom, and then a large slab on top. And inside was just real small bones, just a few of them. It was a secondary burial from someone during that period. There was carbon there, and we did get a carbon date, and it fell in that same period. So the mound construction was being made during that late Middle Woodland period. So we assumed that a lot of the sites in that area, because of the presence of that type of pottery, date in that particular area at the time.
The Oneota time is right after that, or is that also
Right.
called Oneota?
Well, Oneota people, there was a river, Iowa River, called Oneota River up in northeast Iowa. That's where it was first identified, the culture. And Oneota were Mississippian. We call them Mississippian people, Mississippian culture. And they lived during the time of late woodland times, all the way to the kind of what we call proto-historic. They lived in villages, some huge villages stretched for miles up in Des Moines County, north of Burlington. They were semi-permanent, semi-sedentary. They built large structures, and these were really substantial. They were held up with large poles, large exterior perimeters, roofs, things like that, and they lived in groups of these houses these people lived in. And they lived around 1200, 1300. Many believe they lived all the way up to 1500 AD, prior to European contact. And during that whole period, in Iowa, we have Oneota, we have Great Oasis. That's a group of people. They're woodland, essentially, but they start living in big villages again. And Great Oasis, we find them in central Iowa, along with Oneota. Oneota are found in western Iowa, mostly up around Des Moines, large Oneota populations, and in eastern Iowa, all the way up in the northeast Iowa. And so there were other cultures all over the Midwest that developed at that time, very similar to Oneota. When I would say Mississippian people, essentially it's a culture that we believe is cultural influence that was coming up from Mexico, up the Mississippi River, and all the way up to Wisconsin. And outside of St. Louis, you'll see one of the largest cities, Indian cities, in North America, Cahokia. And Cahokia is a national site. It's an incredible interpretive center there. But if you ever visited, it's in East St. Louis. You'll see the largest earthen mound in North America. And you can walk up on top of this mound. It's a huge temple mound. And once you see that, you realize it's amazing what Native American people could do and what they accomplished, actually. So in our particular area, I have never found any evidence of Oneota or those large villages like you would find in the late historic period. Most of seem to be semi-permanent little woodland sites that are either middle woodland or late woodland, around 600 AD. Now, when the settlers start moving in, that's a whole interesting...
Okay, before you get to that, I want you to get to that, but I do have a question about this one little burial box.
Oh, the burial box, yeah.
If you were to guess, that's a little kid. Is that what you're thinking? That you said a small group of bones, and a small group meaning a small individual or just one person? This sounds like a lot of fuss for one.
Well, when it comes to mortuary practices, it's very diverse, very, very diverse. Mound building in itself is very diverse. We may all classify those people building mounds as woodland culture people, but in my experience, I found mounds that you could barely see. They were almost the size of a grave. Or you'll come in sizes that they're really noticeable on the landscape. Hillocks, literally walk up top of them, and there could be 10 feet high, and extend over, 50 to 100 feet.
What did you find here, this place?
This particular area was a small mound. Probably it was 15 feet across, and maybe originally 2 or 3 feet high. But when they interred people, they did it all different ways. Some are laid in a prepared grave type for extended burials, where the whole person was laid in there, in the flesh burial. But the majority of them were not. The majority of them were retained burials. There were secondary. People were buried somewhere else in a traditional way. Like your Plains Indians, the Plains folks had platforms, and they would bury the dead in a platform. But you remember that seasonal round, they were still involved in that stuff. So a lot of times people they died in the winter months. Really hard to dig the frozen ground and that sort of thing to bury someone. And so what they do is bury them above ground. And then the people would move away into the winter camps. And then when it warmed up in the spring, they would come back. And they would visit their relative, the person that passed away the year before. And what was left, the animals had picked, the birds, things like that, but they're open to the air, open to all the elements and all the animals that would feast on them. And they would gather what was left, and a lot of times it was just a handful of bones. Maybe the leg bones, larger bones, and they would bundle them, put them in a bundle. And then when they interred them in the ground in the warmer months, they prepared a pit. In this particular case, they went kind of elaborate a pit. They carried large slabs of rock, dug a pit, and then made a kind of a box tomb and covered it over. And in some areas, they don't do that. They just bury an earthen pit and then put a large slab over top of the burial. But everyone you see is different. Very, very diverse in terms of their practices, even though they're building mounds, over the burial. Iowa Village is unique. It's a world-class archaeological site. The Iowa people were a Sioux-speaking people. They are, we believe, their ancestors were Ioway. They were Mississippian. The Ioway people lived in western Iowa. They lived in eastern Iowa really early on. They lived up in northwest Iowa. They moved around a lot. But this particular site, it's along the lower Des Moines River, and it's right out just not far from the town of Eldon and Selma. It's kind of in between. And it relates to Jefferson County because it's right on the edge of Jefferson County, between Jefferson and Wapello counties. And it's a very early site. It represents that period of time when natives became in contact and in trading with Native Americans. It was a time of serious political strife between tribal groups because the tribes out east, Massac, for example, were being pushed west, and they would push on other natives, groups. And the Native American people were in turmoil because of white settlement and the whole Western movement of people. They were living there early on. They were living there when George Washington was having his first set of wooden teeth made. That's interesting. And it's just right not far from here. They lived there to about 1828, as far as we know. And I became interested in the site back in the early 1970s with Dr. Dean Straffen. Dr. Dean Straffen was a kind of Iowa expert on Oneota at the time. And there was also theories back then that there was a relationship between Oneota, prehistoric Oneota, and modern Ioway people. And he was interested in finding this particular site, the Ioway Village down in by Selma. And I happened to take up that cause, and I always spent a lot of time going around looking for it. And what's interesting, I talked to a fellow called Fred Fulton. And Fred Fulton is a famous name. It's Fulton's Red Man of Iowa. It was written by one of his relatives, I believe his uncle. And the family lived in an area just outside of Selma in a hidden valley. They call it Turkey Scratch because the early settlers had to scratch for a living. But he had a farm there, and he had all kinds of knowledge about where the Oneota, not the Oneota, but the Ioway Village was, and he had a huge collection. And his son has a huge collection from that particular area. And I just asked him, I said, you know where it's at? And he says, it's right over there, and he pointed. He says, that's where my uncle, he was a postman, and he would ride his horse from Fairfield to Bloomfield. There was a trail, and they'd deliver the mail. And during one of the floods, 1903 in fact, when he came across that site, he found just all kinds of trade beads and things that were washed up from the flood, different types of artifacts and stuff. And he told me, he says, right down there in the floodplain. And of course I went there, got permission to walk the area, and I walked, and sure enough, here's this incredible historic village. And I was certain that it was probably the Ioway Village. You don't know if it's the Ioway Village, or it's a Sauk and Fox Village, or a Potawatomi Village. You don't know, see. So that's always in question. But I came back to Parsons College and talked to Dean Straffen. I said, Dean, I think, and I had a big bag full of trade beads and everything. And he just jumped around, and I thought he was going to pass out. But that started a whole history in terms of trying to find more information about it. And we had organized some field surveys to go over it and do some collecting. The problem happened was the discovery was brought to the news, and that was a disaster. No one should have known it happened, because right after that article came out in the Morning Register, there was just 1,000 cars down there, people wandering everywhere trying to find something. It's human nature, But that's a story of it when we first found it. And over the years, I've tried every possible way to get people interested, the archaeological community, interested in and doing something, more research on the site, because there's very few sites, historic villages like that are well preserved in a rural setting. Because if you do go across Iowa, for example, where many of the villages are located is where the towns are located. So if you go in Davenport, there's a site in Davenport, you know. You go to this site, Muscatine, there was a Muscatine site, the Muscatines. And so these sites aren't available to excavate or to find out any information about them, because Europeans came in and settled on them. Eddyville, for example. Eddyville is an excellent example. When the territory opened up in 1842, Eddyville was the start of the Oregon Trail. A lot of people don't know that, but that's where they started. And there was people, thousands of wagons came in. And the territory opened for settlement, 1842. And people got there in December. My God, you're not gonna be caught in a wagon on the prairie, you know, in the middle of December or January. And there was a village in Eddyville. There it was, the native people, the Sauk. It was called Hardfish's Village. And the people had just left, abandoned it. Their lodges were still there. Everything was there, the big village. And many of the settlers came in and said, I want that lodge and that. And that's what they did. They went in and spent their winter living in the Indian village and survived the winter. Now that's just some history, but you know, it was Hardfish's Village. Now getting back to the Ioway Village, much of the information about where these people lived, the story behind it, came from a fellow called Jordan. Mr. Jordan was a trader, and he had a trading camp, actually a trading house, west of where the people lived there. And he was the one that came up with the story of the Ioway, and he also would tell a story about how the Sauk, Black Hawk came down with the Sauk and they attacked the Ioway Village. And they attacked, the Ioways had a racetrack, which was west of where the village is located. And they were out there, the whole group of them, racing horses and having a good old time. And Black Hawk supposedly came down and attacked them all and massacred them. Well, we found no evidence when we actually got involved in going on the site, studying it firsthand. We found evidence of massacres or anything. And a lot of it comes right from Black Hawk, because Black Hawk, he was asked bluntly, were they involved in that? And he says, no, I don't know anything about it. And Black Hawk died down there. That's where his last resting place was. His cabin was just about 1.5 miles from where the Ioway Village is located. And over the years, I tried to get people interested in the Ioway Village, doing more follow-up, more. And eventually, it happened. Here a number of years ago, we got a special grant that allowed us to go on the site and do remote testing. That was the first initial phase of investigation. And that's what archaeologists do now. They don't just dig. You spend a lot of time augering, doing remote testing, using electronics to penetrate the ground, penetrating radar, things like that, determine what you're dealing with. And we knew we were dealing with a large site and potential of many features. A feature, an archaeologist would call a feature, it's a non-portable artifact. For example, if you dug a large hole and filled it with trade axes and covered it up. We came over penetrating radar or some other type of electronic device. We could determine what that was. If we had metal locator, it'd show up. That hole and all the contacts would be called a feature. Well, anyhow, that's what we were doing, trying to determine the size of the site and also what it contained. And we did an incredible mapping of the whole entire site area. And we found out that there was actually earthworks there, two circular areas of villages. Like there was a smaller one and another one, and extending over many acres, and a whole series of subterranean pits, and all through the site. And then we organized a sampling those areas. We used the results of the remote sensing, and the map that was created, very detailed map of subsurface features, and then we selected very specific areas on that map to do small test units, and there were essentially 1 by 2 meter sized test units. And he would send it down, and we were looking for, of course we were looking for artifacts, but we were looking for those features and evidence of those features. And we found a number of large cache pits and documented that the site has incredible potential for research. It's an amazing site, and there's very few of them like that still left. So hopefully someday they'll come back to the site. We had a representative, Mr. Murphy. He was from a representative from the Ioway tribe there, and he was so impressed with it. And you could see that there was interest in the Ioway people. Maybe somehow we could get funds to buy the site and just bank it, put grass over it and preserve it as a preserve, an archaeological preserve. That's what should be done. Because maybe 100 years from now, they'll have some new technology that we can go into and kind of reconstruct the way they were living there, or glean more substantive information about what was going on the site, how they were living there. So it's amazing that we have such a site. I would say it's like a Herculaneum or something right by, in close proximity to where we live. So a lot of people are interested in that early historic period when the first settlers came into Jefferson County. This whole area was part of Wisconsin territory. And there wasn't a Jefferson County in say 1836 or so. 1832 is with the Black Hawk Purchase, and that came clear up to where the eastern boundary of Jefferson County is now, and that was all called Henry County. And then there was later on in 1830s there was a addendum to that purchase. And it made Henry County larger. In fact, it made it to where Jefferson County's western boundary is now. And by 1837 or 1838, then they split out a separate county, Jefferson County. But when people were first moving in,
at the Skunk River. Is that right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and see, Lockridge was the kind of ground zero back then in the late 1830s. Round Prairie Township is the area that the first settlers moved in. The Coop family and some of these others, they moved in. They came in there, across the Skunk and into the Big Cedar, and they crossed that area, and they set their claims out in 1838, 1839. And there's a lot of people wrote a lot of their experiences down. diaries and things of that nature, and especially descriptions of what the land was like, the geography. Well, the geography was amazing. It's not like it looks like today. Areas that we see ditches weren't ditches, you know. There were just nice little swales in the landscape covered with prairie grass. Most of the landscape today is more exposed and rugged, especially the drainages, and that's all a result of the 1920s and the 1930s, farming up and down the hills. Our river valleys were choked with vegetation. The prairies were like Fairfield's located at, and along the flat prairies to where like going out to Batavia, were no man land. You never went out there with a wagon, because you never get back. You just disappear in the muck. Because the upper prairies were, when it rained, it was a marsh. There was bulrushes, and you would just literally disappear. Your wagon would just go away. And you'd have to walk back through the slosh and mud and stuff. So people, when they first came in, they stayed away from the prairies. And they went into along the stream areas, because that's where the trees were. That's where the trees that had food on it, like nuts and berries, plums and all that sort of thing. And they were big trees, which means you can cut them down and make a really nice cabin out of the oaks. Up in the margins of the prairie were bur oaks, huge bur oaks, and you'll see some of the large bur oaks still in Jefferson County in Chautauqua Park. You'll see some white oaks, but there's a lot of beautiful bur oaks. And a bur oak is a unique tree because it has to have grass, a fire, to actually make the acorns grow. And it's designed to withstand prairie fires. It has a real thick bark to it. And it's on the margins of the prairie. And so you'll go in Iowa and you'll see right on the edge of a flat area, these huge bur oak trees. But when the settlers came in, there were all sorts of maple trees, hard maple, there was soft maple, there was hickory, there was parsinum trees, there were chestnut trees, or groves of chestnut. And it was a paradise. I mean, it literally was a paradise. And the native people had crisscrossed this land. They had thoroughfares everywhere. And the reason we have documented these things is when the land was later, U.S. land surveyors came in to actually survey the county, survey the township lines, and then go into each township and survey all the section lines. If you look at their notes, it's their aptly most interesting thing, and because he'll be running a line and he'll say, "No, we hit a tree that's like 5 feet across," you know, or they hit this, or they hit a stream that had a certain type of rock in it. There was a coal seam that was burning, you know, things like this. But really important when it comes to archaeologists and early history is they note, like up in the southeast corner of section 23 by Germanville up in Walnut Township, they noted this huge group of wigwams, and they marked down, because he surveyed right through it. And so where they surveyed, the prominent feature of that area, he marks down in his notes. And it just happened, huge sugar camp. Or Indian Trail. There's a wonderful Indian Trail running north and south. And Jefferson County was just, there were Indian trails going everywhere. There were Indian trails that went from Fairfield all the way down to Bloomfield, all the way down to the Skunk River, to the east, all the way down the Des Moines River, all the way down to the Ioway Village area. There were trails going west, there were going trails over east. Now, the Indian trails were important because even though they were difficult or impossible to take a wagon on a trail, by horseback or by foot, these things were established over probably hundreds of years. And they went along the easiest part of the landscape, like a stream. It would be going over a stream where it was shallow. It was a natural ford, a rock layer or something. And the rest of the stream is 3 or 4 feet deep, and right there it's 6 inches. And so the trail went across. Well, the settlers soon realized that these trails were really important. A trace is another thing they call them, a trace. And then it became the natural ways to get around in these unsettled areas were the Indian trails. There were no roads back then. I found some original trails, and they're located in the Fox Hills wildlife area in Wapello County, and you can see some of the original trails there that go over the bluff and down. Whether they're actual Indian trails or real early settler trails, it's difficult to say. But there are traces found in Iowa in some areas, but they're usually in state parks and places like that. The landscape has changed so much, and I guess people don't realize what white settlement did, Europeans, how they changed the land. When natives lived here, they lived in a very unique area, beautiful area. They could live and not really affect the environment that much, you know. They were using all natural things. Yes, they did strip bark off trees, and they would kill trees, and you'll see a lot of dead trees. But a lot of the dead trees they chopped down, burnt using fire, and made dugout canoes out of them after they died, or used the wood burning or you know, fires and such. But they didn't change the environment. They didn't build roads. They didn't dam up streams. They didn't kill all the native grasses and things like that. They lived with them. And when the European came in, the first thing they did was cut everything. You always could tell how long a white settler had lived in an area by how big the clearing was. The other thing they brought in was hogs. Hogs were the most destructive animal on the planet, one of the most destructive. Elephants do a really good change. But for a small little creature, a hog does a really good job of it. And they had no fences. All they had was a claim and timber. And they would leave their hogs just run wild, all through the timber. And that was true all over the Midwest, Illinois, Missouri. They still do it today in some places. In Iowa, believe it or not, buy a timber and just let the hogs live in there. But the hogs root, they create all kinds of erosional scars on the landscape, and you see probably the first erosion, serious erosion occurring in timbered areas from hogs. So anyhow, what I'm saying is, when the first settlers came in, they saw a picture that would soon change. Everything's going to change. By the 1840s, 1850s, there wasn't a tree standing anywhere. They were bringing trees in. They had to bring trees in on wagons for shade, because all the native stuff was gone. all the beautiful chestnuts you could live off of. You could roast chestnuts. These are eating chestnuts. Beautiful stands of chestnut trees were cut down for furniture. The furniture, oh my God, look at these. They're 3 feet, 4 feet across. Cut them down. It's like the redwoods, get rid of them. We're going to make something. But the impact of Europeans on the landscape was amazing. It's just really amazing. Changed a lot of things. And of course, that really seriously impacted native people. And so the native people moved on. Some moved on, some didn't. There was a lot of native people who stayed, especially Sauk people, and actually blended in with the white population. And there's a number of people, especially in Van Buren County, their families have Sauk blood in them. They're native, partial native people. In Jefferson County, and mostly Iowa, you got to remember like Tama, the settlement in Tama, big Native American. The land was raised by an Iowan, a white fellow, to buy the land to bring the native people back to Iowa. I mean, if you look at the story of it, it's different than you read or see in the news. They weren't warring, they weren't fighting. The Sauk people, we mentioned a sugar camp. The sugar camp was, going to sugar camp early in the spring was a tradition that went back probably thousands of years. I think a lot of these are sites that we find Firecrack Rock, some of the broken stones there. They were using cobbles, take sap, put them in large hollowed out logs, take hot stones, put it in there, boil the sap down to make sugar. And this was going on for a long, long time. And that tradition was very, very important to a lot of these tribal people. And in the turn of the century, 1920s, even up to the 1940s, there were still sugar camps. People from Tama came down and went down into Jefferson County. They went down to Des Moines County. They were down in Lucas County. There's historical accounts of groups of natives coming through town with horses and wagons, and there's a whole bunch of them, and they were going back to their traditional place to make sugar. And there were still groves of hard maple in existence then, but soon they were wiped out, and that kind of ended the whole sugar camp thing for the native people. It was kind of a lost tradition. It just when it was lost, I don't know, but probably by after the Second World War. Basswood's a soft, fast-growing tree. Amazing stuff for native people because it was a great resource because the bark, not just the wood, the bark is the most important because you strip that bark and you hit it and hammer it, you pull off fibers that are strong fibers, and you can build all kinds of weaving ropes, clothing you can make out of them, and that was a main source of making cordage was basswood. The wood is real soft, but it's awful carvable, so you can cut it and burn it in sections. You can carve it out into bowls and make all kinds of cooking utensils and things like that out of food preparing type bowls and things like that. But the early bee treaters used them for making casts. They would make a cast out of the linen and pack it with honey. They take the whole honey, all the honey and the combs and everything, put it in there and seal it up. And there was one instance where the fellow had to leave and he had to store his honey. And I think it fell overboard. That's what it was. It fell overboard. He came back later and there was some native people there, and there were probably Sauks. And they helped him find it. And there was all the honey was left. I mean, they didn't even take the honey. They were, you know, but there seemed to be some sort of good relationship, pretty good relationship between the native people and the first settlers. Yeah, in this particular area, there was there's no evidence of any conflict whatsoever. There was some talk about because native people were still in the area. They were going back and forth to the hunting grounds, their sugar camps, and somewhere some early settler, the lady of the house, was making cornbread. And the old story goes, she was making cornbread, and and she had the ovens going, and here a group of native people were coming along, and of course they smelled the cornbread. Oh, so they were there standing in front of her cabin, you know, and she gave them some cornbread, and they just went nuts. Well, it's really good. So it was a day or two later, here comes a whole bunch carrying sacks, and they had all this ground up cornmeal, and they say, would you do us a favor and cook a whole bunch of cornbread for us? And she did, apparently, and used their cornmeal, and so that's the type of stories that were handed down. You know, how true they are. I think there was no aggressive story, you know, anything like that I could find out in early historical accounts. But there seemed to be a really a good relationship with native people. And getting back to Fairfield area, the Iron Cross was in one publication. It's a later history of Jefferson County. And the Iron Cross was 2 feet high, and it was 18 inches wide. And Charles Negus, who was a judge and later he did research on native prehistoric stuff and had some publications, used it for a paperweight on his desk. That was the story. Whatever happened to it, I have no idea. But it was supposed to be on that bluff. That was, it was actually quarried. That area used to be real prominent and extend way out into the valley, and it was all excavated, cut up for sandstone building blocks. I worked in Bentonsport. It's along the Des Moines River in Van Buren County. Very interesting town. It's a National Register site. And one thing working there, I was studying, trying to gather as many photographic evidence, early photographs of Bentonsport when it was in its heyday. And there are quite a few photographs available. And one thing I noticed that struck me the most is how vacant the landscape was. If you look at Bentonsport today, it's nestled in this timbered covered valley. Back in 1850, it was a barren knob. It was almost like a desert, a bunch of brick buildings in a desert. There was not a tree to be seen. The impact that they had in their settlement was amazing. Even in Ottumwa, Iowa, in turn of the century, you couldn't, in the morning, you couldn't see the buildings downtown when you walked because of the coal smoke. You couldn't see out the windows. The impact of civilization on the landscape was absolutely amazing. And above all of it was the erosion that took place. The farming, the stripping every area, especially in the critical areas we call high erodible areas, were along stream valleys and the little knobs and hills, because that's where the people built their homes. They built their homes along those stream valleys in a wooded area. They cleaned off the trees and planted corn on these knobs and stuff. And of course, they all eroded away. And all that went in the stream, filled up the streams, or made huge ditches, you know. So, and it happened in a short period of time. And by, you know, World War II, the landscape was so changed It's pretty amazing, you know. But those changes were early, 1850s, 1840s. There were people coming in Jefferson County in the late 1830s, 1838, 1839, and by 10 years later, 10, 15 years later, I mean, it was just amazing how things had changed. And the natives were they just couldn't believe it because they knew there were the older people had seen it as it was and how they lived, you know, and how European culture, American culture now, but changed everything. So people need to know that. I wish we could go back and probably people would just weep if you saw it the way it was and what it became. And so any effort we can do to restore those things, even a little parcel somewhere, restore the native prairie or prevent the land from washing away, anything we do like that is really will contribute to our children, so they have some appreciation of the way the land used to be.